Do aliens exist? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. Do aliens exist? Philosophy deals with a lot of out there questions, and maybe one of the most out there questions here on Earth is, do aliens exist? Well, I like to begin these sorts of questions with going back to the origin of creation. We go back to the void, nothing exists. All of a sudden, in the blink of an eye, creation unfolds. All of a sudden, we have places to live. And in regards to aliens, we should do some math, right? Because as we know as humans, we have all these theories as to how exactly Earth came to be and how we got in our orbital plane and how all of the conditions came to Earth to create this Goldilocks zone, as we call it, where everything was just right so that Homo sapiens could emerge. And orthodox science at this time generally thinks that, Earth was a rock and it got into an orbital zone and created an atmosphere, and a certain amount of light from the sun started hitting it, and combination of gases and fluids and whatnot all sort of coalesced. And then at a certain moment within these primordial storms, electricity through the means of lightning struck either a rock or sort of a goop and catalyzed amino acids to start forming the first cellular life on Earth. And then evolution sort of just takes its march and we go from being these simple-celled organisms into through a bunch of different fast-tracked evolutionary processes into human beings. But the point just being that, just life in general on Earth, but human beings specifically, right? So that was one set of circumstances that occurred out of the initial unfolding of creation out in space. And scientists here have essentially figured out what the numbers were for those things to occur. Both, like in every way, the conditions necessary for that to occur, the odds of that occurring, what the numbers of our biological constitution are, what the different cells we're going to require, all the different numbers and empirical evidence that could be derived from our march from non-existence into existence. Scientists have been figuring that out for a long time, to the point where they created mathematical models to determine the probability and what the overlays would look like to put into other areas of creation to look for circumstances similar to our own for creation of beings that would be, well, quite frankly, very similar to Homo sapiens, these bipedal, advanced, carbon-based beings that exist in a very specific atmosphere on a terrestrial planet, above ground, all these very specific scenarios, right? And when they've taken those formulas and they've gone back, which we're going to do now, you take that formula and those overlays of essentially the modeling of the creation and existence of Homo sapiens / human beings in a very empirical sense. And then you go back to creation, and we know that we have that, right? We're like, well, there's that one example, because when creation happened, there was, all bets were off. Everything just sort of got thrown out there in a permutation table, right? And we're using ourselves as the evidence that out of creation, we know for sure at least one semi-intelligent species was born out of it that we call humans. And we have what we think are working equations and numbers to model it, right? So go back to creation, and the first thing we do when we start to do a scan based on our numbers is we should look back and go, okay, what are the numbers we're dealing with in the universe, right? So we know that the basis of any form of life in the way that we are thinking of it, or really in any form, requires a local celestial body, aka a star, a sun, right? So when we go back to creation and we look, let's look at just the Milky Way, right? So the search begins with star systems. So when we look at the first iteration in the Milky Way, okay, how many stars are just in the Milky Way? Well, current estimates place the number of stars in the Milky Way alone between 100 and 250 billion stars. 100 to 250 billion stars. How our Earth is a sun, that means there might be as many as 250 billion solar systems residing simply within the Milky Way. Okay, now on top of that, that's the Milky Way. Possibly 250 billion suns in the Milky Way alone, possibly more. Remember, we're just little, humans down here with fairly rudimentary scientific instruments trying to figure this out. So upwards of 250 billion suns just in the Milky Way. Now, how many galaxies are in creation? Estimates are hundreds of billions of galaxies. And we can safely assume that they're all rocking hundreds of billions, if not more, stars within themselves. Okay, so I don't even know what the names for the numbers are when they get that big. Trillions upon trillions, like trillions of trillions. For all practical purposes, for the sake of not breaking our human mind, we can refer to that as infinite. There's infinite stars. As far as the mathematical possibilities and the possible permutations go, at some point, in terms of being in the physical reality, when a number gets to a certain level, you kind of just got to say, well, that covers all the bases. And this is just at our base level of knowledge of creation. So when we take that into account, the fact that creation is practically speaking limitless in terms of essentially every conceivable permutation can be allowed in the material reality for all practical purposes, then when you decide to search for life off of planet Earth, which is one planet, if you put 1 over infinity, it's pretty small, but also it tells you everything you need to know. So if we take our narrow empirical modeling of the circumstances and creation of humanity, and we use that for the scanning algorithm, if we use that to scan creation for life, even in that, which I consider to be a completely narrow-minded way to search for life, to model, if we're the only species, and we think that we're the only species, and we've decided that in our search for life that we're just going to model ourselves mathematically and then use that for the whole scan to scan creation for life, that's obviously, I mean, it's nearly narcissistic, to be honest. But even under that highly narrow scan, it is 100% certain that we're going to find at least one other instance in creation of life that fits even that super narrow scan in that really limited modeling is guaranteed. You're scanning infinity essentially. How could you not find it? Not finding it is not the proof that they don't exist. Obviously, finding them is proof that it does exist. But theoretically speaking, you don't have to provide the evidence. When we do in the theory of it, the philosophy of it, we just have to be able to deduce that, like, yeah, it's inevitable. Like, intellectually, it's a sure thing. And intellectually, it is a sure thing. Creation is practically infinite, right? And when I say this narrow modeling of this scan for life, we're doing things like, oh, we're carbon-based life in a certain atmosphere, and it has to be all these certain particular factors, and the list goes on and on and on. But even on Earth, we're constantly getting our minds blown by the different ways in which biological entities exist, what the base of their creation is. You know, there's like ammonia-based creatures. There's like non-carbon-based creatures. There's creatures that exist in environments that seem impossible to exist in because we're constantly putting a human overlay on them. They have those, like, just one instance is they have those marine animals that exist near volcanic thermal vents, and they're filled with, like, you know, sulfur, and they're super high temp, and everybody was like, oh, nothing can exist there, and then finally got close enough and they're like, oh, something exists there. And then there's just innumerable examples of life existing in many varied forms, in many varied environments, ranging to nearly all the extremes. And that's just on Earth and in its close proximity that we find life in all these seemingly inhospitable or unexistable conditions. So theoretically, it's a done deal. They do exist, right? At least in my opinion, at least in my analysis, in my philosophy. So that's the strictly theoretical level. Now, that's for just simply looking for beings of origins of other planets, right? Then we have all these different aspects of when people discuss aliens. We're talking about also beings from other dimensions. Now, I guess technically beings from other dimensions would also have to have an origin on a planet to be a physical being. So I guess they're covered under that. But that's another way to scan as well. So we have these different dimensions, these different phase-shifted realities that we can access and that people have reports of being accessed from. So that's another place to scan for life. And in the practical manner, in the modern day, a person can go to YouTube and access, at this point, millions of hours of footage from individual humans from throughout the planet, all across the planet, all different decades, all filming UFOs. Independent, like an absolutely irrefutable amount of independent videos, all filming off-planet technology visiting us. Different countries, different languages, different types of craft, many incidents having multiple angles of the same craft. No way that they could be faked. Obviously some are, but no way that the preponderance of all these like millions of hours of UFO footage shot by unsuspecting citizens of Earth could be faked, especially many of them are old and predate easily accessible post-production effects. Also, the U.S. government, also, the U.S. government in 2020 yeah, they admitted that they exist. So there's that. And when we go through the catalogs of shaman and mystics and sacred texts and paintings and cave glyphs, all matter of artifact, witness, testimony, discussion, folklore, popular artistic depiction throughout human history, including the Bible, all specifically depict and reference aliens and alien visitation. Completely unambiguously. The whole point of many of the depictions was to specifically say how important the visitations were, how much they affected the evolution of humanity, and the fact that they were very real. And in some cases, the dominant presence in the reality, to the point where humans really couldn't even like get their lives going. You know, like, man, we got all these higher intelligences here, and quite frankly, it's not very comfortable. So on all these different levels, like theoretically, it's inevitable that they exist. That I say they, but like it's inevitable that creation supports more than one form of life on another planet. There's trillions upon trillions of trillions and trillions of star systems, practically infinite. So really, the height of ignorance would be to say that human beings are the only conscious intelligence life that has sprung up in infinity. When we really study, when we really drill down into what the creation is, when we look at what the function of our sun is, and we look at what its relationship is with the planets, and then we see that other suns have similar relationships with their planets, and that relationship being that it holds planets in orbit, it gives them energy that they need to support life, and it keeps them spinning around. It keeps them as life laboratories. It seems as though the only actual function of a sun is to support life on planets that orbit them. And if we accept that as what their function is, and then we admit what science says, that there's trillions and trillions and trillions of them, it would be weird, and I think incorrect, to deduce that if the function of suns is to support life, and we have practically infinite number of them, that life is only sprung up in one place. To me, that would seem to be the ignorant position to take. Because when we're discussing this, the only thing we have to admit is that in all of infinite creation, there's simply one other place where life sprung up. That's it. We don't have to say that the whole place is populated. All we have to say is that in the vastness of infinity, there's just one other place where life happened to spring up. And that's before we get to YouTube and look at all the footage of all the life from other planets visiting us. So, do aliens exist? Yeah. Well, thanks for spending some time here at Philosopher's Corner. I hope you found it helpful, and have fun.